Module 8, Conflict is not always a bad thing. Hi, this is Dr. Davis, and we are now going to begin our final week together when it comes to the presentation part of the class. And no class on organization and human resources would be complete if we didn't talk about conflict. It's just part of organizational life. You've noticed by now that the theme for this presentation is Batman. It might seem strange to some, but not to me. I chose this theme for a simple reason. Batman epitomizes, at least to me, the conflict manager. Have you noticed that his entire existence is devoted to dealing with the conflict created by the villains attacking Gotham City? It might be the Joker, the Riddler, or the Catwoman, or whoever. All of them are stirring up conflict because the goals of those villains are not compatible with the goals of the citizens of the city of Gotham. Keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. Now, this module doesn't attempt to provide you with a toolbox of solutions to conflicts. We did that a little bit in the master's program in the communication and problem solving class, where we provided you with some very basic ways to deal with problems, conflicts, as well as how to handle the communication that's associated with them. I think it's better for you to understand the nature and dynamics of a conflict first, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll discuss some possible approaches to resolve it. But you really have to understand what are the elements of conflict? How do conflicts behave? Because even though you might think that the conflicts are unique from situation to situation, there are some basic parts to them that are very similar. So, when you understand what makes a conflict tick, how it works, you'll be in a better place to create your own unique solution that meets the demands of your conflict. Because in truth, your conflict is going to be different than my conflict. And we may be leaders of two very similar schools, but the conflicts are going to be different because there are nuances that shape the conflict. The people are different, the situation is different, the culture is different. So even though no two conflicts are exactly the same, they share many characteristics, and that's what we want to look at in this presentation. The authors want you to take away from this lesson that we need to understand those characteristics so that we can approach the conflict in a way that minimizes the deleterious, the negative effects of that particular conflict. So without further ado, and with the bat signal on, let's get started. James MacGregor Burns once said, "The potential for conflict permeates the relations of humankind, and that potential is a force for health and growth, as well as destruction. No group can be wholly harmonious, for such a group would be empty of process and structure." If you're around people long enough, you're going to encounter conflict. It just is the way we are. We shouldn't be surprised by this reality. It's a universal constant, just like change. Whenever people are found, there is going to be opportunities for conflict because there's going to be disagreements, and even sincere disagreements on how to proceed, how to deal with a particular situation, or how to achieve a goal. Even the most pious gatherings at churches and religious centers, with loving and caring and giving people, there are going to be times when there's disagreement, and unfortunately the disagreement is allowed to grow into a conflict. And that's what Burns is saying here. The potential for conflict is in all of us and every organization that we create. So for us to have the attitude that we don't want any conflict, that conflict is bad just because it exists, doesn't make sense, doesn't line up. And that's one of the reasons I put this quote here for you, is because I want to change a mindset that that looks at all conflict as bad. Now, I'm not saying I want conflict-ridden organizations. Don't hear that, because that's not what I'm saying. But the key here is that we must make certain that conflict becomes a force for health and growth rather than allowing it to destroy the organization. So when you look here, Burns makes the statement that conflict can be good and it can be bad. It's good if it promotes health and growth for the organization. But if it doesn't do that, then conflict is bad. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, okay, if conflict is normal, then his next statement, no group can be wholly harmonious, makes sense. Conflict is neither good nor bad, and so every organization is going to have it. And the reason why we're going to have a lack of harmony all of the time, in other words, the potential for conflict, is that any organization that was completely harmonious all of the time would not have any procedures, would not accomplish anything, and would probably have no structure. Now let's look at the word harmonious for just a moment. Harmonious is different than unity. Notice he could have said, no group can be wholly unified. When you have harmony, you have some people singing the melody, and you have some people singing harmony to that melody. They're singing a different set of notes. They're singing a different part, alto versus soprano, or tenor versus bass. But it is that harmony that makes the organization successful. And what's implied in harmony is that while we do different things, we follow different procedures for the activities, the goals are all the same. What we're trying to achieve is beautiful music, a wonderful organization. So harmonious, he's saying nobody can be completely harmonious all of the time. There are going to be times when someone's going to sing off key, and it's that time that we need to come and deal with the person singing off key, who's out of step, who's not in tune with the rest of the organization. And that's what we'll be looking at really in this presentation. One of the first things that I think we've got to get out of the way is to really look at what is conflict. And I'm sorry, I'm not satisfied with the definitions put forth by the authors, that conflict is parties seeking incompatible goals. Now, I place that definition here just as a way to compare it to what I think is at least a more descriptive definition, and it may not be a completely accurate definition, but it certainly takes us a bit further down the road. So noticing that the author's definition in green, seeking incompatible goals, I put that conflict is competition over scarce resources. And that may not be the total way to look at conflict, because not all conflicts are about resources. Some conflicts deal with policy, rules. Some conflicts deal with just the nature of education, personality. But I think better than incompatible goals, competition is the word to focus on. That conflict really is a competition. Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. At least that's the conventional wisdom. So competition over scarce resources suggests that conflict is a verb, not necessarily a noun. It's active. Conflicts, while no one may be looking at them, they're happening out there. They're acting, they're moving, they're bubbling, they're simmering, whatever other term you want to put there that shows that there's action. Someone has done something that frustrates another person, and the second person is taking action in retaliation. So there is an air in the competition that it's more than just that healthy competition between two soccer teams, two football teams. but that what's happened is somebody is frustrated, and they have responded to that frustration in a way that has caused friction with another party. So the key, though, in just looking at this definition, is that I've not said anything negative or positive at this point about conflict. I've just said that there's a fact, that there is a competition. And how we perceive the competition and the actions that we take in relation to the competition is really what sets the conflict apart in a term of negative and positive. Of course, we have to look at that in a different context. When you hear or read the word conflict, what mental image comes to your mind? Is it a physical fight, a couple arguing with one running away crying, a nasty contentious divorce? You've heard about those, seen them on TV even. Or something else equally unpleasant. The point is that we usually don't think of fuzzy little bunnies and fields of beautiful flowers when we think about conflict. We've been taught that conflict is a bad thing, and it is to be avoided. Your parents probably told you in a frustrated tone, "Why can't you two get along?" Or, "I don't care whose toy it is, give it back to her so she'll stop screaming." The idea that people are supposed to get along was also reinforced by your teachers, the social groups that you hang out with, your churches, etc. It makes sense that as much as possible we should live at peace with one another. But the reality is, to live a conflict-free life is just not in the cards for us. And those who try to do that, I think, are deluding themselves. And that's what makes this topic interesting to me, is that we try to think that, wow, if I can just keep everything on an even keel, there will be no conflict. Well, from what I'm going to tell you in this session, that's just not possible. So let's be clear. It's not the conflict that bothers people. It's often the hostility that's associated with the conflict that people don't like. And I'm one of them. Hostility develops when one side of the conflict decides that there are only two outcomes, winning or losing, and that one must win at all costs. So let's review there for just a second. That people who typically engage in hostile behaviors tend to see only two potential outcomes, winning and losing. And nobody wants to be the loser. So what ends up happening is that people do what they have to do to win at all costs. Now, when we think about hostility for a moment, hostility is a means to this end, the end being winning at all costs. It's used to hurt the opposition to the point of destroying them. I know it may sound melodramatic, but it's still true. The focus is on the person, not on the issue. So when we're dealing with hostile work environments, or we're dealing with just hostility from a really ugly argument, typically they're not hostile about the issue. They're more hostile about the person, and then they become personal in saying things that are mean and designed to hurt the other people. So they make the conflict personal by taking steps to purposefully hurt the other side to advance their position and increase the number of their followers. Now, in this scenario, conflict is a bad thing, because it not only do the parties to the conflict suffer, but the organization may also suffer. It is something that must be avoided, and it's the reason behind why conflicts must be managed. Suggesting that the parties just shake hands and forget it is not a suitable management strategy. But we'll talk more about this later. If you use that strategy, you need to stop using it now, because it is not going to work. All that does all that it achieves is it just forces the conflict underground. It's like an underground fire in a coal mine. You may not see the fire, you may not feel the heat, you might see a little smoke, but the bottom line is that does not mean the fire is out. And so we'll look at some, what I think are more effective ways of dealing with a conflict in this session. Now, I know you have seen similar diagrams in your textbook, as this one is on this slide here, where the authors treat the conflict spirals as separate events. In one event, the potential outcome is negative, whereas in the other, the result is positive. What I've done is combine them, because I believe that any conflict has the potential of going positive or negative depending on how it's managed, or I should add here, how it's not managed. The critical response, and you see that in the middle of the diagram there, determines how the conflict proceeds. If the initial response is negative and unproductive, it is likely that the outcome will be unhealthy for the organization. So you can think here that when there's a conflict, if the initial response by one party is hostility and some kind of attack, then probably you're going to have a negative critical response. That response is by the other party. They will respond in kind. And if it's a positive response, then you'll probably minimize the conflict. You will de-escalate it. And while there may be a misunderstanding at the heart of it, the reality is you will not enlarge the conflict. Now, I assume here that the organizational culture is threatening and coercive when we see that negative spiral, that negative turn. A threatening culture, a culture where people aren't valued, a very Theory X type culture. It's not likely, though, if the culture is positive, if it's a collaborative culture, you probably aren't going to have a negative response. You're going to have a positive response. Now, in the alternative, if the initial response is positive, it's more likely than not that the result will be growth and organizational health. Neither outcome is likely when the conflict is managed. Now, that may be an oversimplification. I'm not saying that if you don't manage it, you'll probably get a positive outcome. If you don't manage the conflict, I don't see a way for you to get really any kind of positive result from this. I think you're going to find that it's an unhealthy response, or at best, it's not going to be a resolved conflict. It's going to go underground. It may dissipate. The conflict may eventually dissipate as people get involved in other activities or people get transferred to other schools. But the heart of the issue, the seed maybe that makes it grow, might still be there and will germinate again. It'll come back. It's like weeds. You may cut the tops off and think, oh, well, I got the weed. But in reality, if you don't dig it up, that weed's just going to come back next summer. And that may be with the conflict that's not managed. But when you take steps to address the conflict and deal with it and resolve it, then it's done. And it shouldn't come back. Louis Pondy provides 3 common sources of conflicts within organizations. Now, I note that in his list, there's not a mention of the interpersonal conflicts, which seem to abound within so many organizations. Probably the largest source of conflict can be traced to disagreements over the allocation of resources, and maybe that's not so true in schools, but in most organizations, that's usually what people get riled up about. We're used to working with less in schools. It seems that each year teachers are told to achieve greater results, but are given less resources with which to use. There are a number of copies that teachers are given each year seems to get smaller and smaller. Consumable resources are decreased, and even the parents picking up the slack, there's still just not enough to go around. This emphasis on frugality can spawn conflicts. This becomes a problem when there are some resources and they must be divided amongst a great number of people. Do you give everyone a little, which is not enough to really do anything? Or do you give the resources to the department or the teacher that seems to be able to make the most of them? Or better still, do you make the departments justify why they should be given the resources? No matter how you slice the resource pie, someone is going to complain that their friend's slice is larger than theirs, even if it's ever so little. The reality is resources do cause a lot of conflicts. Other issues that relate to this interpersonally are conflicts over the amount of work. So not having enough resources, it also may be some people are complaining that they always get assigned the responsibility, the duty, and other people don't get assigned it. Well, and it's because they're not effective and they don't do a good job, and so the principal doesn't want to give it to them because he wants the job done right. Well, of course, we've talked about this in past courses where a good leader forces even those who don't do a good job, gives them responsibility to teach them how to do a better job, to hold them accountable, that they also have to contribute. I suppose that it's human nature, but no matter how great the responsibilities that we've been given, we tend to protect our turf. We take exception to outsiders or those from other departments coming in and taking control or telling us how to do what we do. Now, maybe this can be seen more at the administrative level than from below, where most teachers are. But when it comes to reorganization of a school system, like some of the current schools are doing across the nation, and the change of reporting relationships becomes a part of this new organizational structure, you begin to see territorialism, where managers want to be sure that they have as many people to supervise as their next door neighbor. No one is happy when a group is moved from one department to another. Interference can also come in the form of blame. This is where one person blames another person for not doing what is needed to be done on time, which made the second person's contribution to the project late. And I mentioned that just a moment ago, that people oftentimes have conflicts when they have to work together, because in a group project, there seems to always be the slacker, the one that the whole group has to carry in order to get the job done. And yet they all get the same grade. So that can be a source of conflict. People take ownership over their work for the most part, and they resent it when someone comes along and tells them to do it differently or doesn't pull their weight. I worked for a principal who would assign a project with no preconditions or special requirements, and even though I would ask this principal up front, is there any particular way you want this project addressed? And the answer would always be no. I was given basically a blank page and told to use my imagination, a new project. Then when I turned it in, I was met with a barrage of suggestions of things to change. Well, I don't want it this way, I want it that way. I think you need to do this rather than that. I would go back and revise to comply with the suggestions. After this happened several times, I wised up. I started providing a somewhat detailed outline of the project and turned it in to the principal so that she could make her suggestions, and I didn't have to change much. I just had to add to what I had done, because she routinely would say, well, I think you need to do this. Have you thought about that? And I would take care of it as a part of the project, but I didn't have to erase, or I didn't have to start over and go in a different direction. You see, everybody wants autonomy, but seldom do we get it, or at least the level of autonomy that we want. Interfering in how people do their work can be a source of great conflict. It's perceived as a lack of trust, even when the interference is sincere. And that lady was sincere with me. Nothing bad about what she did, but I really felt like she didn't trust me to do a good job. And so it kind of hurt that it was like she was going behind me and trying to fix it. It was like, why don't you just do the project yourself? See, that's the attitude that a lot of people get. It's like, well, if you're going to do it, then I don't need to do it. Lastly, conflict can arise when two people are asked to work together on a project. Yep. Group work, I just told you. They may agree on what needs to be done, but not on how to go about doing the work. As each person believes that their way of accomplishing the task is the only or best way to proceed, a conflict develops. Obviously, this conflict can halt all progress on the project until it's resolved. To those who hold a contingency view of conflict, they see each conflict as unique and thereby needing a unique solution to the conflict. What needs to happen is that many voices must be brought together to participate in the solution. That's the key, is that everybody, even all marginalized groups, need to be involved in the solution for the solution to be valid. To achieve this, they focus on developing a culture that is designed to productively manage the conflict, to bring people together, because they believe that it's going to be people who pull this solution together and resolve the problem. But those who hold a process view of conflict suggest that though we perceive conflict to be a rather messy endeavor, a chaotic endeavor, it's actually quite predictable and episodic. In the first phase, one party is frustrated by the actions of another, which triggers a response. It is this response that causes friction. At this point, each party conceptualizes the conflict. Who's at fault? What really happened? What was done? What was said? What are the causes? What must be done to resolve it? And each side of the conflict, and there may be more than two even sides to the conflict, may see the problem from a different perspective and therefore see a different route to the resolution. Now, the next phase involves the interaction between the parties. This includes escalation and de-escalation of the conflict, because you have two options here. You can escalate it or you can de-escalate it, and that takes practice to know how to de-escalate. It's very easy to escalate, not always as easy to de-escalate. Hostility is a part of this next phase, because if someone is upset, they may say something that hurts the other side, which just makes them angrier, and they decide what they're going to do is to take action. They're going to attack. Malevolent attacks being another aspect of this phase too. Malevolent being the evil side of this, where they are not just reacting, but they are purposefully, consciously, premeditatively deciding how they're going to try to hurt that other side. The final phase of the conflict is the resolution of the conflict and any accompanying emotions regarding it. Because even if the outcome is resolved effectively and everybody walks away a winner, there are still going to be some emotional issues. People are going to have feelings about the conflict and how it was handled. And that's going to be part of this final phase as you address those emotions. Now, the third view is called the structural view. It's called this because the focus of the people is on how the structure, reporting relationships, policies, and procedures are responsible for the conflict and what must be done to limit their negative influence. Conflict, in a structural point of view, is an indication that there is a problem with the structure or the rules which must be addressed. If not, the conflict will only get worse. How do you know if you have a conflict? I know this seems like an obvious question, but the author suggests that not every tempest is a conflict. I mean, you might say, well, I know there's a conflict because these two people aren't speaking. Or in the faculty teacher's lounge, so-and-so's talking about the other person. I mean, we intuitively can see when a conflict is occurring because we watch the body language of people that are involved. But what the authors are trying to say is that there is a difference between a conflict and a misunderstanding. Now, the authors make the distinction between those two for a very good reason, because they see that at the heart of every conflict is a misunderstanding or a misperception. We hear what we want to hear, or we don't hear what we think we want to hear, or we don't hear something that we should expect to hear, and then we draw the wrong conclusion. Because we can look at things and think one thing, and it'd be totally off the page. So if no additional steps are taken, you have a simple misunderstanding. So if even if I've drawn the wrong conclusion, if there's no action taken beyond that, and it's all still within me, I don't ask any clarifying questions, then there's really no conflict. I may just have this misunderstanding until somebody hears me say something based on, says, no, that's wrong. You're misunderstanding what's going on here. Now, don't forget that even as a misunderstanding, it needs to be dealt with, but it's not a conflict. Misunderstandings are due to poor communication. Either the sender of the message did not clearly say or write what he or she meant to say, or the receiver just didn't understand the message because of some of the barriers to communication. And they failed to ask the right questions. See, a lot of times you'll hear something and it won't sound right, but you don't ask the question that needs to be asked so that you can get the clarification you need to draw the appropriate conclusion. A conflict develops then when a misunderstanding is allowed to fester and one party takes a negative action. And now this can be simple as informing a supervisor that the other party has not done their part. And boy, can you get from misunderstanding to conflict really quick. This action escalates the misunderstanding, which causes the other party to respond. How dare you go to the principal and say this? You didn't even know what you were talking about. And then they go to their posse of friends and tell them what happened, which then starts people choosing sides. Of course, emotions and attitudes become intertwined into the misunderstanding, as well as the bystanders. They get drawn into one side or the other. It begins to take on a life of its own, fueled by each party. Everybody adds something to a conflict. It's not just one party over another. It's everybody doing something. And the bystanders fuel it. And there are people who they love to see conflict take place, so they egg people on. It's kind of that whole group mentality. People do things in groups that they would never do by themselves. And of course, that's what makes conflict so difficult, is that there are so many people stirring the pot, as it were. Then hostility or withdrawal, that's actually not the conflict. So when people get hostile or they withdraw from it, that's not conflict. Those are just symptoms of it. So just seeing a dysfunctional relationship is no evidence that a conflict exists. One must determine if the parties of the conflict are seeking mutually exclusive goals, that they're trying to get to two different places, but they really want to get to the same place, but they're using such divergent methods that there's no way that they can work together. I mean, it's not possible for two people to walk in opposite directions and get to the same place. It's just not going to happen. And that's really what happens in a conflict. You've got people who are working at cross purposes, perpendicular purposes, which means they're not going to meet at some point. Edward Thomas documented 5 ways that organizations deal with conflict. Some are more effective than others, but the first is the competitive win-lose approach. Each side does what it can to strengthen their position, at the expense of the other side. Usually this degenerates relationships as the conflict progresses because the hostility between them becomes very personal and the attacks very malevolent. It is predicated on the belief that one side must win and the other side must lose. There is no middle ground. What makes this approach to dealing with conflict really makes this approach not an effective way to go is because even once the conflict is resolved, there are still hurt feelings and a tendency to hold a grudge. The second approach is the avoidant orientation. One side refuses to deal with the conflict. They don't engage in escalation, nor do they engage in resolution. They bury their head in the sand and believe that if we don't acknowledge the conflict, it cannot hurt anyone. The truth is that the conflict remains intact, and they will have to be dealing with this conflict at a later date. In this scenario, there are no winners or losers. It's a draw. And I worked with a principal who, that was his MO to everything, was just leave it alone, not do anything. And that weed of conflict, that plant, all it did is just drop its seeds, and what was a relatively easy type of conflict to deal with became this generational conflict that went on and on and on year after year and just basically destroyed the organization. The third approach is called accommodation. It's characterized by appeasement. The other party's concerns become the chief focus of resolution. One party gets what they want while the other gets nothing or very little. Why would anyone do this? It may be that after looking at the bigger picture, it makes more sense to give in to the demands rather than fight it out to the bitter end. So when we look at the situation during World War II, and Neville Chamberlain, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain, went to meet with Adolf Hitler, and they negotiated a treaty, and Chamberlain came back to Great Britain and announced that we have peace in our time, because Hitler was going to go no further than Austria. He had just taken over Austria and reunified Germany, and that was it. But what ended up happening is that Hitler went into Czechoslovakia, and then he went into Poland, and he basically took over all of Western Europe and most of Eastern Europe. And of course, they reached a point when the Allied powers had to come and fight Adolf Hitler. And that started with Great Britain, and they had to liberate France, and then, of course, attack Italy and the Axis powers. But you see, at some point, if you just try to do the appeasement route, it may not really be the most effective way to deal with the conflict, because that can embolden some people when you give in to them. Well, then they go even further. They don't just, if you're agreed that I can do this, I'll stop. No, a lot of times it just makes the situation worse. The fourth approach is called a sharing orientation, where both sides give a little. We might call it a compromise. In this pseudo win-win, because that's what it is. I notice I use the word pseudo. It's not really win-win, because it doesn't meet the criteria for a win-win, because neither side got everything they wanted. They were forced to give up something. It was a negotiated settlement. And usually those are better than appeasement, because at least you get something you want, but it's not a perfect solution. The final approach is called the collaborative orientation, and in this approach the goal is for each side to get exactly what they want. No bargaining, no compromise, no arbitration. Everyone walks away satisfied. It's truly the win-win approach. But I will tell you, it is often the most difficult to achieve, because first and foremost, you have to get people to understand and state what it is that they really want. Many people in a conflict, they have a general idea of what they want, but in order for the collaborative orientation to work, everybody has to be upfront, honest, and say, this is what I want. This is what it will take for me to feel validated and resolve this situation. Using these 5 approaches can be very helpful to you because once you know how the sides are dealing with the conflict, you can choose a strategy that would be most helpful in achieving resolution. Here's an example. If both parties are approaching conflict from the perspective that it's a competition, then a collaborative strategy is probably not going to be successful. Because when it's a competition, one side says, I have to win, they have to lose in order for the resolution to be successful. In the same way, a compromise approach may end the conflict, but it will not produce organizational unity because neither side leaves the transaction happy. They were both forced to concede something that they wanted. Obviously, a collaborative approach is the best option, but unfortunately, not everyone is willing or ready to deal with the conflict using this approach. So where does this leave us as school leaders? Well, there are some ideas that I think we need to take away from this session. First is that conflicts have to be managed. And a part of that management means that they have to be dealt with in a timely fashion. Now, when it comes to making decisions, I've told you that there are certain times when it's good to just wait to make a decision and choose the best time to make that decision. But when it comes to conflict, waiting is not an option. You need to start dealing with that conflict right away. And so the truth of the matter is leaving a conflict alone will not help it to go away. It'll probably allow it to get worse. There will be more victims, more casualties than if you manage it right up front and right away. Another point to just take away is that we've got to change our attitude towards conflict. It's not good, it's not bad. Conflict in and of itself is neutral, but it's how we perceive it. It's how the conflict is promoting growth and health within the organization. If it's doing that, then conflict may be good because it's getting us out of our comfort zone and allowing us to take advantage of new opportunities. But if it is destroying relationships, if it is the structure or the rules that are causing the problem, then we've got to address those. It's not a neutral thing. I mean, it's not a good or bad thing. It is just a neutral item itself. Key in understanding conflicts is this, that it's all based on perception. And to most people, perception is as real as reality, and in some cases even truer than reality. So it's our perception of the conflict that makes it good or bad, not just the conflict in and of itself. Conflicts that are left to themselves typically degenerate. They get worse. They don't get better. And so that is the call for us, is to get out there and start dealing with that conflict. As soon as we know about it, deal with it. Now, the authors will tell you that you've got to manage the conflict before it's a conflict. And at first glance, it makes you raise your eyes. Well, if I don't know that the conflict exists or the conflict doesn't exist yet, I can't deal with it. Well, that's true. But remember, what's at the heart of every conflict? A misunderstanding. And so therefore, you need to deal with misunderstandings as soon as you know of them. Someone presents an idea, it's like, wait a minute, that's not what I said, or that's not what I intended. You need to clarify that misunderstanding right away so that it doesn't grow into a conflict. And then lastly, conflict, and this may seem counterintuitive, but conflicts are relatively predictable. What's going to happen? If one side escalates, well, then you can be pretty sure that the other side is going to respond. But that there are multiple phases to a conflict. And so knowing where you are on that line is important. Being able to read a conflict is an important skill. And the only way that that skill develops is having more experience in conflict. The more conflicts you deal with, the better you're going to be in reading that conflict. Well, this ends our session on conflict is not always a bad thing. I hope that you've enjoyed it and have gotten something out of it. Look forward to seeing you the rest of this week and this term. Obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I look forward to hearing from you. This has been Dr. Davis, so we'll see you online. Take care now.